movement and motivation are so closely linked because when dopamine really goes badly wrong, say in Parkinson's, like you have difficulty initiating movements or stopping them. And you sort of see all kinds of things about how our feelings of will and drive are associated with actually moving. And there's this whole idea about the brain being a prediction engine now and what that means in terms of dopamine.
And that was award-winning journalist and author Maya Szalavitz, here to help us rethink what addiction actually is, and if addiction is not really about pleasure. For decades, we've been told this familiar story. Addiction happens because drugs hijack the brain's pleasure systems, people chase a high, and the solution is to make the consequences severe enough for people to stop. But what if that story is incomplete? And what if it's actually harmful? Maya begins to challenge one of our biggest misconceptions in public conversation. Addiction is not the same as the physical dependence or withdrawal. Instead, she describes addiction as a compulsive behavior that continues despite negative consequences. A definition that changes everything about how we understand drugs, social media, technology, punishment, recovery, and even care. I'm Autumn Finef, and I'm joined by my co-host Noah John Siracusa on this episode of Breaking Math.
All right, Maya, let's start with the science of addiction. What actually happens in your brain when you're addicted to a substance, and what happens when you withdraw from it?
So I think it's important first to get some definitions down because a lot of people are kind of confused about what addiction is. And the most commonly accepted definition is that addiction is compulsive drug use or other behavior that occurs despite negative consequences and that continues despite negative consequences. So the withdrawal part, like a lot of people want to sort of emphasize that, but you can have withdrawal without addiction and addiction without withdrawal. So in the past, addiction was sort of defined as sort of physically needing a substance to avoid withdrawal. And what that meant actually was that crack was not addictive because basically when you quit alcohol or benzodiazepines or opioids, you get really physically ill. In fact, from alcohol and benzos, you could actually die. And so you're puking and shaking and it's very physically visible. But there's no such syndrome with cocaine. You crave the heck out of it and you feel awful, but it doesn't produce the sort of classic physical dependence. And so Scientific American in 1982 or so was like, cocaine's just as addictive as potato chips, which of course we now know potato chips are addictive. But the point back then was that, it's just you kind of want more, but it's no biggie. Of course, we now know that that is actually the essence of addiction is the craving and the desire for more and the continuing even when you don't want to do it anymore. So in the brain, we don't 100% know. But what seems to happen is that, so we've got the dopamine system, right? And a lot of people think dopamine equals pleasure. If you actually tried to go on a dopamine fast, which you could do by taking some antipsychotic medication that blocks your dopamine receptors, you would feel quite lousy. In fact, the extreme of your dopamine system being screwed up is Parkinson's. Basically, because movement and motivation are very closely tied together in the brain. And so what dopamine is doing, as far as we know, there's sort of still controversy over it, but one version of it is that what it creates is wanting. So it makes you crave stuff. Like when you sort of experience an unexpected reward, your brain, shoots out some dopamine and you feel like, I got this and I want this and I want more of it. And so that is in contrast with what is called liking, right? And as you would imagine, liking is actually enjoying the thing that you want. So infinite liking is not a problem. You're satisfied, it's all good. Infinite wanting is really bad and not at all pleasurable. Wanting can be pleasurable in the sense of sexual desire, in the sense of oh yeah, I'm psyched, I'm going to get this thing. But unsatiated wanting is horrible. And so this idea that like dopamine is pleasure is really, really wrong and deeply problematic. But how dopamine is involved, as far as we can tell so far, is that it is looking at whether a predicted reward is actually received. So technically reward prediction error. And so what's going on is that like when you first experience, like say cocaine, it's an unexpected reward. It feels really good, blah, but the thing is next time you take it, it's an expected reward. So you don't get as much dopamine. This can escalate into a problem. And this is massively oversimplified, and there's many other things going on. But what happens over the course of addiction, and particularly so with stimulants, which directly affect the dopamine system, they are acting on that receptor. What happens is you really, you first take it, you feel good, you want more, but then you start to take it and it doesn't work anymore. And okay, so you try taking more, but instead of actually giving you a bigger high, what you get is anxious and paranoid and feeling awful. And so in the last days of my own cocaine addiction, I was like, I know this is going to suck. I don't want to do any today. It's going to be really terrible. And I really don't want to do it. And then I would find myself shooting up. And it would suck just as I had predicted, but I couldn't stop the wanting. There was no more liking. Liking tends to be generated by your brain's opioid system. And this is sort of why you can have things like people can take methadone or buprenorphine, which are actual opioids, and have it be satiating because they're not escalating wanting the way a stimulant does. Whereas if you try to do stimulant maintenance, people end up just wanting more and more and more. Except if they have ADHD, in which case you might be treating the ADHD and it looks like you're doing stimulant maintenance, but that is complicated and not to the point here. So anyway, what happens over time with dopamine in the brain is, and I'm probably going to get the direction of this backwards, but it starts from one point in the striatum where it's getting majorly activated and it moves to a different. And at the first point, what you're getting is just sort of typical wanting. But when it moves to the other part, what you end up with is compulsive behavior. And so you are in a kind of automatic loop. You are not even like you want it, but you know that you don't want it, because it moves to a part of the brain which sort of automates behavior so that you can, like if you're learning to play the piano, like you don't want to have to be thinking about what you're playing, to the extent, because once you get good at it, your fingers know what to do. And if you're not in that state, you're going to play badly. So, but it's good to automate like piano playing or riding a bicycle or any of these other things. Not so good to automate shooting cocaine. But we have these systems to automate these behaviors so that our conscious mind can.
That was amazing. And I'm so glad you started by defining terms. Autumn and I both come from a math background where the biggest lesson in doing math is define things properly, that even there's a belief that the theorems are less important than the definitions. So really knowing what a term means and using it precisely is utmost importance. One other kind of connection to math that came up in your answer that I didn't know about that was intriguing. You mentioned this kind of predicting what will happen and the dopamine kind of adjusting our behavior based on when that prediction doesn't match reality. And just at a very rough heuristic level, that kind of reminds me a little bit of training AI systems where they're trained to predict, how a robot should move, how a car should drive, how a chatbot should communicate. And they get these rewards. We kind of upvote them if they did the right thing. But for instance, like if a robot's trying to learn physics, they might watch YouTube videos and predict where a ball will travel after it leaves someone's hand. And the robot is really trying to make predictions, and it'll learn physics by adapting those predictions to reality. So I don't want to go too deep into that because I don't know about this, but it sounds like our dopamine system is a little bit like maybe reinforcement learning, where it's kind of guiding us.
Actually, the root of reinforcement learning is the dopamine system. That is where
really
it comes from. And so, I mean, obviously there's Skinner before they knew anything about the brain, but the reinforcement learning is one of the things that dopamine does. And I always have found it interesting that like movement and motivation are so closely linked because when dopamine really goes badly wrong, say in Parkinson's, like you have difficulty initiating movements or stopping them. And you sort of see all kinds of things about how our feelings of will and drive are associated with actually moving. And there's this whole idea about the brain being a prediction engine now. And what that means in terms of the dopamine stuff is that when you are anticipating a reward and you get a bigger reward than you anticipated, this is great. And you a positive reward prediction error, no problem. But a negative reward prediction error where you're predicting it and it doesn't come in, then you sort of feel like you're punishing yourself for not getting it right. And your dopamine is kind of going lower. This is also why novelty wears off. And in order for novelty to wear off, you need to have something become boring. And this is again like when you think about ADHD, which may involve issues with the dopamine system, you're not finding things motivating and you are, you need more novelty. But in order to learn, novelty has to go away because otherwise you're not learning, right?
So, from an evolutionary perspective, do we know why our brains are susceptible to addiction? Is this some sort of byproduct of another
Yeah. I mean,
mechanism?
what I think is that I see addiction as a learning disorder. And we have a system that is designed to make us persist despite negative consequences. And that is the system where we fall in love and take care of our kids, right? And that's all the dopamine, all the same stuff is going on in there because the brain does not divide it up by functions in any way that we understand. So when you fall in love, you're getting these rewards and you are going to persist despite negative consequences to continue to be with that person. All of the horrible things you see people do in addictions, you also see people do in love in the wrong circumstances. And all of the persistence that you see, you could never be a parent or a partner if you couldn't persist despite negative consequences. I mean, you got to deal with literally a lot of poo if you're parenting and you have to deal with, people are a pain in the butt, right? So, like, if we didn't have a system that allowed us to persist through that, we wouldn't be able to, reproduce or survive. We have to persist despite consequences to get food sometimes, right? So we need to be able to learn that, like, sometimes you got to get through punishment to, like, achieve your goal. The problem is if it's misdirected towards a substance, then you are persisting despite consequences in a way that is not either evolutionarily sound or good to experience.
Is there a difference with regard to addiction when we're talking about a substance versus an experience? Because I can imagine a drug, a chemical is a substance, but social media is an experience. So are they the same forms of addiction or is there something neurologically different?
I tend to think it's pretty much the same. I think the fundamental stuff is pretty much the same. And it tends to be driven by intermittent reinforcement. And so, you can't predict when you'll get the reward. So you persist. Bad boyfriends do this, or girlfriends playing hard to get. We have all these things where we are aware of how reinforcing intermittent reinforcement is. And gambling addiction, which is kind of, to me, I think gambling addiction is like the purest addiction because you don't have any chemicals actually in there changing things. You are simply responding to this intermittent reinforcement and these stimuli that like are giving you this sense of prediction and resolution to the prediction. So this also may be why we like music so much because like I don't know about you, but like I will listen to like something that I really like, I will listen to a million times because I'm happy accurately predicting what is coming up next and also happily surprised by the things that musicians do that are sort of creative that you know, do not meet your that give you a sort of positive reward prediction error because you're like, oh, I like that even better than what I was thinking.
So can we zero on that for a second? Because I still want to unpack your first answer where you were talking about the difference between liking and addiction. So take a song. How do I know if I'm addicted to a song or if I'm just liking it 1,000 times? What is the difference?
So yeah, the key for me is that addiction is harmful. If you persist compulsively despite negative consequences to raise your child, that is a praiseworthy thing to do for the most part. I'm not sure, like if you're robbing drugstores, that might not be such a good thing. But if you the question of whether something's an addiction or not has to do with, is it harmful to your life or not? And so this can become like, let's say, you could be addicted to like running, right? And it's good for you, maybe will extend your life, whatever. But if you are like running to the point where you're not doing your job and you're not like being there for the people in your life, then that can be considered an addiction. So it's not about, it's always has this kind of sociological or cultural piece to it that you just can't get out of it. Like we try to like, oh, we'll just do physical withdrawal as the sign of addiction. The problem with that is again, cocaine does not do that. Gambling does not have that. And also Prozac does. There's some blood pressure medications that are cause physical dependence, but people don't rob drugstores for them or anything like that. You could even die from this, but you don't know that it is causing the problem, so you're not craving it. It's so I think the real essence of it is just being trapped in a compulsion that isn't working for you.
So, in that case, are there any evidence based methods that can help you fight the addiction, whether that's drugs or even technology or what other habits you may have?
Sure. So, I mean, it's kind of interesting. The GLP drugs look like, the Ozempic like drugs look like they may actually be a kind of universal anti addictive, anti compulsive kind of thing, which is really interesting. And, this is clearly going on in the brain, not the gut. And people just say, don't want it anymore. But what's interesting is they still like it. And so, if you get into a life of absolutely no wanting, which I guess is like sort of a Buddhist ideal, but in this way it is bad because if you don't want anything, you just are amotivated and you aren't satisfied. You're just like in a state of pleasurelessness and lack of, anything. It's just nothing. Um don't want to completely get rid of wanting because otherwise, like, you're not going to go to work, you're not going to get out of bed, but you want to have the right level of wanting basically. And you also don't want to get rid of liking because then you're making things pleasureless. And there is a drug that blocks opioid receptors called naltrexone. Another drug, naloxone, also does it. That is the drug that is used to reverse overdoses. They sometimes try to use naltrexone, which is a longer acting opioid blocker, to treat opioid addiction. The problem is it blocks your natural endorphins also. And so people can get really bad anhedonia, which, you see when people are given a choice of what medication to take for their opioid addiction, they tend to choose the things that activate the opioid receptor, like methadone or buprenorphine. Heroin itself can be used. The Some people will try naltrexone, and some people actually have decent results with it. But a lot of people just find that it's like making life pleasureless, which is not helpful. So I think what you want in order to recover from addiction is another source of pleasure and meaning and purpose that is not destructive. And sometimes, like, most people with addiction have a history of trauma and or a predisposition to a variety of different mental illnesses. You need to, in most cases, you will need to address those things in order for the person to recover. It's very rare that somebody just gets addicted because they got exposed to something and it's like, oh, I love this, I'm going to give up my life for it. Usually what happens is you get exposed to something like that and you're like, oh, this is really fun. And I could see myself really getting into trouble with it, but I have a job and I have kids or whatever. And you want, you just have a life. If you don't have a life, the pleasure from drugs becomes much more attractive. And that's really where you see people getting addicted. And so that might be driven by mental illness like depression, anxiety, PTSD, other traumatic related symptoms, or it could be just sort of complete existential despair where you just, you're poor, you're not educated, you don't have anything that you feel, no relationships, you're homeless, you don't feel like you have anything to live for. And this is why it is so ridiculous that we continually use punishment to treat addiction, because by definition, it is compulsive behavior that continues despite punishment, aka negative consequences, right? So, you know, we know that like that is the one thing that it doesn't respond to because by definition it wouldn't exist if it did, right? So, but we get stuck in this idea like, well, if we just punch them more and more and more. And it's kind of like, if you think about it for 3 seconds, who's more likely to recover from anything? A doctor who's got a family and a job and, lots of stuff to live for, or like a homeless person? It's not the homeless person. Hitting bottom isn't what makes you recover. What makes you recover is having something to live for that makes you feel okay, because most people with addiction are trying to medicate something, and there's a million different things you could be trying to medicate, but if you don't have an alternative source for feeling okay in your own skin, you are not likely to get better. And so, the things that people turn to, like, for example, 12-step groups. Some people find them incredibly helpful. And one of the reasons for that is that it gives you a community, connection to other people, and a sense of meaning and purpose because, like, the 12th step is about like carrying the message to others. So you're trying to like help other people recover. And that can be a great sense of meaning and purpose for a lot of people. Also, like the God part, a lot of people get a lot of sense of meaning and purpose from that too. Now, there's a whole load of people who don't benefit, but one of the things that it gets right is that you need some form of alternative connection and purpose.
I can't help dig in a little bit here. Just this is my mind wandering to the AI world, where you're kind of describing these deeper senses of purpose, which could be religion, family, career, things that are very deeply meaningful, as opposed to things that are more superficial, like a positive physical sensation or these more compulsive things. But they're all rewards in some sense. One is maybe more diffuse and long term, and the other's more acute. But when we think about training AI systems, as far as I know, I don't see that distinction, right? There's just reward for behavior that we want and discouragement for behavior we don't. So do you think there's
Well,
okay, go ahead.
I'm kind of curious, like, how do you actually reward an AI? Because I know that, like, is it just like it lives rather than dies? Like, because that doesn't feel like a reward to me. Like, I mean, obviously you want to live rather than die, but it doesn't seem like they don't have pleasure. So what is the reward actually giving them?
Yeah, that's a great point. So just to kind of zoom out for our audience, a lot of AI systems like LLMs have sort of two stages of training. One is where they go through a lot of text and they try to predict the next words. And there the reward is basically they're told, oh, if you predicted the next word in a sentence correctly, we leave you alone. And if you don't, then we'll punish you with some little error that'll back propagate and adjust the neural network. But then there's this second phase of training where they're actually interacting with humans, where a human will ask them a question and they try to answer it. And the human will give like a thumbs up or thumbs down, a positive or negative reward signal that also will update. So you're right, it's not an existential, like, I will die if I don't get this right. And it's not a pleasure or pain, but there's some signal that basically, if you are not, if you get a question right, you do more of what you did to get there. And if you get it wrong, you try something else. So it does feel very different.
Because to me, like what's kind of interesting about all of that is that, like, yeah, you are basically training them in a way that addiction is training people. But the problem is that there's no subjective experience of pleasure. So it's hard to understand like how it works other than, and I mean, I guess you get to this issue very early in evolution because like, the things that wanted to live lived. If they didn't want to live, they didn't persevere and then they didn't reproduce and that was that. So it gets very existential very quickly. But I do think, I mean, I've really been fascinated by these parallels because I think that sort of understanding like what a reward really is, and we can say in humans, this is a specific chemical experience that like when you feel good, the same things are happening no matter what is making you feel good. I mean, there's differences in terms of like wanting versus liking, but all wanting and all liking are probably pretty much the same pathways. And so that's whether it's food and I mean, the sort of people who look at the predictive brain stuff, there's a sort of universal currency of reward in the brain, which may be dopamine, but again, probably more complicated than that.
The food's a great example because I feel good when I eat a bunch of junk food, right? It tastes good, but I also feel kind of guilty. Like, why did I do that? If I eat a healthy meal, often it doesn't feel as immediately satisfying, but I'm like proud of myself. So they're very different kinds of rewards. At least I experience them. And I wonder, like, do we believe they're neurologically different or chemically different, or is this more of a subjective
Well, this
construct?
is I mean, no, I think there is something, and I mean, this is what we're all trying to grasp at in the age of AI taking all our jobs and our meaning and purpose potentially, which is that, when you learn something, you're incorporating it into yourself. And, like I'm struggling to learn music theory at the moment because I'm taking singing lessons. So, okay, would I just have it all downloaded into my head? Like, would I be a musician if I did that? Like, because if I did have that done, I wouldn't have like the horrible experience of practicing and sucking. But the thing about that is that while doing that, I learn about what I want to express and about like the connection between the way I feel and the music, right? So that kind of pleasure, the pleasure that comes from like learning something hard is different to the sort of what people are calling the dopamine driven pleasure of like, just getting that instant gratification. I think that we have to be very careful in trying to understand this because oftentimes we just like, you know, we feel like we deserve something because we worked hard and might be random chance that we got it. But I do think there is a difference between sort of like pleasure and contentment, call it, or I think the Greeks say eudaimonia or something like this. But the deeper pleasures are actually what most people prefer, even though there is harder work to them. Because when meet your husband or something, like when you meet the love of your life, but it is nothing like the actual meaningful pleasures. That doesn't mean there's anything wrong with sort of fake pleasures, like, because like when you think about it, like, is listening to music really that different from like taking a drug? And are those just equally fake? Like it just gets very deeply complicated and existential again very quickly. But I do think it's important to sort of make these distinctions and not to entirely diminish cheap pleasures because sometimes we need them to like just exist to get by, especially in this sort of chaotic age that we're at now, right? But you know, ultimately most people actually do prefer the meaningful things. And like, yes, like we do want to be lazy and like get the cheap things sometimes. If you just look at the way people, and this is why there's sort of this idea that like nobody actually wants to do any work. Like, no, people enjoy creating something and making a contribution and like helping other people. And these deep pleasures that also like, can be a pain in the butt and that you have to persist despite consequences for are meaningful because of that in some sense.
Now, thinking about this, you talked a little bit before about dopamine and pleasure. And like, after this, I'm going to go for a coffee and a bagel. That's my little treat after going through an interview or something, right? So we have that. What does the role of dopamine essentially play? And what do people misunderstand about this?
Well, I think like people think that like dopamine is pleasure, where it's more like a reinforcing signal. And like, for example, you can block dopamine and you can get absolutely high on opioids. So, when a kid like, has been in preschool and they see their mom and it's just like, you know, the that joy is wired in by the dopamine makes you want the reunion, and the opioid is what you feel when you are there. And this is why opioids are so addictive, because it gives you the sense of being warm and safe and loved. The way pleasures are coded, and the differences between them and the similarities. But dopamine does really seem to be sort of the currency of reward, in the sense that it, like, a certain level of it in a certain spot at a certain time is going to signal a certain level of positive experience to be expected, not the experience itself, but to be expected. So, when we hear about people, Lemke comes to mind, or the people who sort of really trivialize and oversimplify the idea of what dopamine does. Um, she is an addiction medicine person at Stanford, and she has a book called Dopamine Nation. And it claims that in order to kick addiction, what you should do is like a dopamine fast, which again would in real life be Parkinson's. But the idea is you should refrain from pleasures. And that is completely backwards. If you're giving up drugs, you want me to give up everything else at the same time too? That's crazy. Like, when what you want to be doing is finding healthier ways of soothing yourself. And, that could be hanging out with friends, going to the gym, having food, like, whatever it is, as long as it's not the substance that you are misusing, you know, but the idea that, like, pleasure itself is the driver of addiction is problematic, because most people with addiction are trying to escape some kind of emotional pain. And it's not, all of the negative stereotypes about people with addiction being, liars, manipulators, selfish, horrible, bad people are about that we're seeking this hedonistic pleasure because we just don't want to work, or we just, don't want to be there for other people. Well, I don't know if you've ever been addicted, but if you have been addicted, it is kind of hard work, because you need to raise a lot of money to get the substance that you are trying to get. And you need to keep doing that on a daily basis, because when you get your drugs, you're going to do all of them. And then you got to wake up and do the whole thing again. It's like, if you're actually lazy and addicted, you are not going to be addicted for very long, because you cannot go and get your drugs. So it is like, it's a ridiculous, racist, frankly, stereotype, because we have, as a culture, tried to demonize people of color and lock them up with the excuse of drugs, and drugs turn you into this, and that they make you lazy, and all of these kinds of things. And that is not true regardless of race. And it is sort of another horrible aspect of our drug policy, that we, again, persistently use punishment despite it not working. And we know this. Like, it is very clear. And yet, again and again, we just want to go back to, oh, well, if we just lock them up, it will help.
But shift this a little bit for addiction, right? You claim that people aren't lazy. It's monetary for a lot of different things. But take it in the sense of, now we call it social media. Other people, I'll say Gary V calls it attention media. That ends up becoming the same dopamine addiction, right? So where do you see that, especially with exploiting those same learning mechanisms as addiction?
Yes. So I absolutely believe that people can be addicted to social media, can be, kind of addicted to doom scrolling, can be misusing social media in a way that is harmful to their lives. And that indeed the companies are trying to profit by making us be incredibly attracted to these screens, and by keeping us engaged for as long as possible, rather than, I'm currently writing about this. I feel like sort of today's media is kind of like crack, where you just want more and more and more, and you're never satiated. And that is what they try to do with intermittent reinforcement and with all these different techniques aimed at, keeping you engaged. That said, if you are okay, you're not going to fall for it. If you are really okay, yeah, you might waste a couple of hours, but then, you got to go pick up the kids, or you got to go pet your cat, or, do some work, read a book, whatever. When the people who end up, and I mean, you can see this in this social media case where they just, young woman who sued and who won a big victory, she had real problems before social media ever came into her life. And she would have not reacted that way to it if she didn't have those predisposing trauma and mental illness factors, right? And so this is not to excuse the companies, but it is to say that if we want to fight addiction, taking away the pretty thing that the person's addicted to doesn't actually solve the problem for that person. Like, that person needs alternate ways of getting their needs met. And, we can blame the pushers all we want, but there are always addictive substances, and some are more harmful than others. And if we're not careful, we push people from a less harmful substance to a more harmful substance. And what's kind of interesting now is like this generation does not do very many drugs. They're on their phone all the time, but they are not smoking weed. They are not doing opioids. They are not doing cocaine. And again, we can have problems with their being on the phone, but we also have to realize that the alternatives may be worse. And again, this is not to excuse the companies who I think should be regulated. And I think that we need to regulate these techniques for creating addictive behavior. And that may, I don't know, they may run into First Amendment issues, but the the real thing to do to help people with addiction is figure out what that compulsion is driven by. Like, you can take away the substance, but if you don't deal with the stuff that's underneath it, something else is going to replace it and it could be more harmful. So it's, again, the social media, human beings are fundamentally interdependent. We fundamentally need to connect with each other. That's where we get our opioids from. If you don't have that, and that's a fundamental part of our stress relief system. We often think like, oh, you're stressed, like go do yoga or something like that. No, like when you're stressed, what you really kind of need most is like a hug or some other kind of social contact that is positive, that is going to, help you feel better. And, a lot of the reason people do drugs is to connect with other people socially because they don't feel like they can without it. So, it's complicated. But I think that we definitely need to better regulate social media. And I mean, I think one of the things like with the AIs that is really quite scary is that it can replicate that relationship, like with those like companions, like it is giving you that kind of reinforcement that you typically get from a relationship. And if that is detracting from you having real world relationships, that is a real serious problem. And that is going to be the most addictive thing. I'm kind of amazed that they haven't combined the sycophancy with intermittent reinforcement, like, because like that's how you really get people hooked. The sort of classic bad boyfriend thing. But, right now they're just doing the sycophancy. They're not doing the intermittent reinforcement within there. And if they do combine them, it's the sort of two different kinds of ways of addicting people. One, the sort of pure social support, and the other being the intermittent reinforcement that you see with like classic Twitter before it became a hellhole. Oops. And
We heard nothing about that.
I mean, because like I certainly saw my addictive tendencies coming out with Twitter in the past because it was incredibly reinforcing when, people like your stuff and it, you get into this whole thing. And also like you're always constantly on the little edge of terror that like something's going to go viral in a bad way.
That's happened. That has happened.
Yeah. Yes. And so, I mean, uh
So let me try being devil's advocate a little bit for
Yes.
technology for a second. So earlier you were talking about how there's a kind of normative aspect where what counts as addiction is really dependent on how things are impacting our life. We can't just measure a chemical and say that's addiction or not. It's basically, is this hurting our life or helping it? So if I go to something like technology, I could very much imagine that in the early days with AI chatbots and all these things, we might say, oh, look, that's a sign of addiction. People are spending all their time online chatting. They're not developing real friendships. This is hurting their life. They're not getting jobs because they're addicted. 10 years from now, those might be the people that are best suited to thrive in a very online AI world. And we might say, no, actually, they weren't addicted. They were just the first to recognize the value of this technology. So could there be sort of generational aspects where one generation's addiction is another generation's utility?
It could be, but I think that I remain a humanist in the sense that I do think that there is a superiority of human connections to other humans, not just to AI. I do think there may be uses of it for therapy and for loneliness that, I am a harm reductionist, right? So if people are not able to access the best possible connection, a slightly less good one, can do in a pinch, right? It's just, you get into the question of like, when are you harming your life by using the substitute? And when are you helping your life by like having some rich source of connection and meaning for you? And yeah, like I struggle with, okay, like if I'm just sitting here really into my music, right? Like, how is that better than being sitting there and being really into my AI? Like it is also kind of a technology and I'm still like alone with my headphones with my music. Like there's no real person there. I mean, the musicians actually made the music, but and I really do not like AI music, but I mean, again, like it gets into these really weird questions of authenticity.
So I have to add to this a little bit. I think this is also bringing people into having more experiences and building together instead of just isolating and being alone without having additional care. Because the younger generations, and I've seen this even with a lot of authors, they actually go for dinner parties and experiences now of getting together instead of everything just being online because the media is constantly bombarding you with things. So if there's ways of having additional, I don't know, guardrails up on whatever AI or technology we're using, that does have a benefit for
Yeah, I
people.
mean,
And
I
that's
think I think that, I mean, I was on the internet in like 1990 before there was a web. And the very early days of being online were great. And yeah, you could have said I actually wrote one of the first pieces sort of exploring the issue of online addiction for like the New York Times Magazine in the early 90s. And I had a long distance relationship at that point, and so I was connecting with him via online, and it was great. Like I
on AOL.
No, this was before AOL. This was like I was like it was like this thing called Echo, which was in New York, and there was the Well in California that were like
Yep.
first BBSs for the public. And so one of my friends actually founded Echo, and that's how I got online so early. Um, I was a producer for Charlie Rose at the time, and we did this segment on, this really new weird thing called the internet. Like, again, like, and then that whole generation was like, oh God, AOL, like, we look down on them because like they didn't get in the first place or whatever. And now they're like not as like cool as us. But,
So you've been into technology for a while and you've seen
and
it develop.
I'm really sad about technology now. Like it's like I remember the excitement of the early internet and the sense that like we're doing something cool and like that we can get the whole world together and it's going to be great. And now everybody's just like, which is going to take your jobs and take meaning and purpose and like not be helpful. And just like sort of that whole business where everything has gotten lousier and like where search is not good and where just everything's commercialized and it's not like connecting you to your friends. It's like making you angry so you stay on longer. you know Yeah, this is, I mean, again, capitalism, but also I do think we should be able to put some guardrails on it. And, as like a kid who was like really weird, like I get the value of like being able to connect online when you can't in the, you know, real world. And I do think that social media still serves that purpose for some kids who, are like the only gay kid in their town or whatever. And they can see on the internet that like, oh, this is not a whole world of like, bullying. Although now that's a little different. But again, like I am not an anti-technology person. And that's why I do these things like compare my like seemingly joyful music experience to like, talking with like I get that there is value. I just feel like we need to be careful of, you know, making sure that people are available to live, their best version of their life. And again, you can't let the best be the enemy of the good, which is where the harm reduction comes in, where it's just like, okay, like suboptimal solutions are sometimes going to be what they are. And, I don't think we should judge people for using media or getting sucked into compulsive doom scrolling or whatever. I think we need to just try to like make it a world where you can go online and read the news and it not be a disaster every day.
So, Maya, you've just talked about your experience really witnessing firsthand the development of our technology and social and information ecosystem over the last 30 years. But you've also been covering the science of addiction for that same span of time, right? For 30 years. What are some of the biggest lessons we've learned about addiction, like things that we know now that we didn't know 30 years ago?
Well, I do think taking us back to the beginning of this interview, that we really are beginning to finally understand that physical dependence and addiction are not the same thing, and that addiction is compulsive behavior despite consequences, and that underlying it is often some sort of mental illness, trauma, or some combination of the two. And understanding those things, recognizing, for example, that with opioid addiction, which has been our biggest problem recently, you know, we have two drugs that cut the death rate from opioid use disorder by 50% or more. These are methadone and buprenorphine if you stay on them. Because we fail to distinguish between addiction and dependence, we tend to say the people who stay on these medications are still addicted. And if they are taking their medication as prescribed, they are not getting high, because if you build a complete tolerance to that. So if you take it at the same time every day, same dose, and the dose is right for you, you can drive, you can work, you can parent, you can do whatever. And you're not still addicted, but you are still physically dependent. And so understanding that distinction is so important for policy and for treatment. The other things, I mean, the GLP drugs are very interesting. I think, if you just look at some of these studies of medical records, now they're not randomized trials, but they seem to show a very strong signal that, and the anecdotes seem to show a very strong signal that like something is happening, that it is reducing excessive wanting. And I also think we are sort of hopefully beginning to understand that because addiction is compulsive use despite punishment, that punishment is not the way to fix it. And we're unfortunately in the moment experiencing a kind of backlash against harm reduction that is completely political and has absolutely nothing to do with the data. There are these claims that like, oh, San Francisco did harm reduction and therefore like they became like a hellish landscape of homelessness and public drug use. Well, which state has the highest rate of overdose deaths by opioids? It is West Virginia. It is not California. It does not have a lot of homelessness because there is cheap housing. What does San Francisco not have? Cheap housing. And it's not about the hippies or any of that stuff. The giving out free needles didn't cause this. They don't give out many free needles in West Virginia. Fortunately, they have started to, since they had, I think it was West Virginia that had an AIDS outbreak and they were forced to do it. Because again, one of the things we learned in the past 30 years is if you provide clean needles to people, you don't get more drug use. You do get a lot less HIV. You can get rid of an HIV epidemic by doing this properly. And so, but there are people who are just like, we can't be nice to these people. Like, obviously, like, being nice to them created San Francisco, and that's why, we've got to like crack down. And again, cracking down has never worked. So I am trying to like fight this backlash.
Now, what's one piece of advice that you wish listeners take away from this conversation?
Be kind and realize that tough love is not good.
One of our most powerful ideas from this conversation is that addiction cannot be reduced to pleasure, weakness, or bad choices. It's often about wanting without liking, craving without satisfaction, and trying to soothe when better forms of connection, purpose, and care are missing. Thanks for listening to Breaking Math. And as Maya put it so simply at the end, be kind.